What is anti-bias education?
Anti-bias education is an approach to teaching that acknowledges and celebrates differences in identities. It's about building a community that encourages diversity rather than shying away from differences. It's really about embracing those differences and getting comfortable with them and talking about them. With an anti-bias approach, children can be more strengthened in their own identity as well as their social identity. And social identity meaning being from a certain ethnicity or having a disability, being from a certain socio-economic class, that's your social identity. And anti-bias education is really about teaching children how they can interact respectfully despite those differences, instead of it kind of being something you don't talk about. Let's talk about it and celebrate those differences. And at the heart of anti-bias education, there's of course equality and
so equity.
Inclusion, of course. So it's really important to discuss things like bias and like discrimination and the impact of those things. So even children can be aware of how things go outside of the classroom, and it really creates a bigger understanding of each other, and that makes the interaction better and more inclusive. So that's really what anti-bias education is about.
Do you have one example for like a barrier that could happen in school or in a classroom that could prevent certain children or one child from learning?
I remember there's a boy in class who had dyslexia, and the teacher was really big on PowerPoint, so he was always making PowerPoints, and the boy fell behind in class because he couldn't keep up with the PowerPoints. So he asked the teacher if he could print the PowerPoint out, like a handout, and just read it in his own pace and do his homework on his own pace. And the teacher refused that because he said, I can't treat you differently, I can't make an exception. But if he had just had the handout, it would have been easier for him to do the assignments.
How is it connected to inclusion?
Well, actually, anti-bias education can be seen as like a practical approach for inclusion. So it's not something different, but it's actually very, very similar to each other. It shares the same value. Anti-bias education shares the same values with inclusion. And one question that teachers often have is, but how can I do it? How can I be more inclusive in the classroom? Because I really want to do it, but I don't know how. And this is actually a good point to look to anti-bias education then, if you have these questions, because it's really like, it shows you how it can be done. It gives you a framework to think about what's happening in your classroom. We will later talk about the 4 goals. So this is something where you can just look to and have like a frame for your work and a way of thinking about your work. And also anti-bias education has lots of practical ideas or suggestions. So it might be called a practical approach to inclusion.
Yeah, I think it connects to inclusion in the way that as adults we actually live kind of beside each other and not together. And if you get there early and get there in childhood, like I said, interacting with each other with those differences instead of not acknowledging those differences, you grow up to have less bias. You can't have no bias, we discussed that. But I think it really shapes the world early on for children. So for example, in the Netherlands, there's quite a segregated education where disabled children go to school, to the special needs school, even though a lot of them could do well in regular education as long as we met their access needs. So non-disabled children, able-bodied children, they don't grow up with disabled children, and what you don't know can be weird or can be scary. So that's how it connects with inclusion, because early on you embrace those differences, you know what is the background of somebody, you know what they can deal with, and you take that knowledge with you in life. And as adults, it's really hard to learn all those things.
Or to unlearn.
Unlearn. That's a good one.
Why should anti-bias education be an essential part of teachers' everyday work?
I think it's essential because you can't exactly leave your identity at the door. So if you are black, you're going to be black in the classroom. If you're disabled, you're going to be disabled in the classroom. And that definitely affects how your classmates see you, how your teacher sees you, how you may be treated consciously, unconsciously maybe. So it's really important to keep in mind that there are different children in your classroom, and not everybody's gonna need the same thing, as in like the practical things, like what I said with the PowerPoint, but also in social things, how a child is to be addressed, or the things they go through at home or in society. So yeah, it's really important to be aware of all those different backgrounds and discrimination that your students may face outside of the classroom, because it's never going to stay just outside. The reality is also inside. So if a black student, hears a racist remark, it's really important to acknowledge that and just name it, like, that was a racist thing to say, because I think it's often that it's accidentally kind of downplayed, like, oh, he didn't mean it like that, and you get stuck on the intention. So it's really important to gather the knowledge and the tools to respond adequately, and really make the room, the classroom, and the school as well a safe place for everyone, for every student.
And it's also important that it's really an everyday approach. It's not something you just do like once a week, in 1 hour, or you do like a project week. I mean, these can be good starting points if you're just beginning, but it's really because of what Hassan said, it's something, it has to be your approach every day in the end if you want to get more inclusive. Yeah,
it's really a practice. Like I said, the teacher with the PowerPoint, he doesn't exclude someone on purpose, but because he didn't have the knowledge and the tools, the anti-bias approach is a new thing. So you accidentally don't meet the access needs of a disabled child, and then you really make the education inaccessible. That is, I think you really have to be aware that as teachers, or as a school, as the institution, you can place barriers or hold them in place. And then the student has to work really, really hard to get over them, or can't even get over them, and that's how we get into the institutional part of the discrimination.
What is unconscious bias?
Unconscious bias is bias that is, of course, the simple answer would be not conscious. This is bias we don't know we have. This happens actually quite often, that we are biased towards people or towards certain groups, and we think we are not biased. We think we are being totally fair and unbiased, but we are not. So this is like the unconscious part, the not knowing about it. And anti-bias education actually assumes that we all have a lot of bias, but also like a lot of it is unconscious bias. So because usually we think, there are like good people who are not biased and bad people who are biased, but in the anti-bias approach, it's like everyone has it and has lots of it. And now maybe the question may be, why does everyone have so much unconscious bias? And it's because we all grow up in societies, and we all grew up and grow up in societies where there are many prejudices, stereotypes, biases, like just floating around. And by floating around, we mean they are everywhere, and we are confronted with these things from the first second we are born. So bias or stereotypes, they are in the way we think about each other, the way we think about certain people, about certain groups. They are in our language, in the words we are using. There are so many words which with like hidden messages about certain people, certain groups. But bias is also, like, maybe I should also say, like racist, sexist, ableist, fatphobic ideas, for example, are also in the stories we tell ourselves as a society. They are but also like in institutions, in structures, so like really everywhere. And you cannot not learn biases or stereotypes when you grow up. And actually research even shows that children from a very early age learn about these things. They, I think research has shown that from the age of 3 to 4, children know, and of course know is in an unconscious way, they know about stereotypes and who is seen as what. And of course they apply these things in interactions with each other and also in interactions with people in general. So you cannot not learn it. And the problem is it's often unconscious.
Can I ask you something, if you feel comfortable answering? What is a bias that you caught yourself in?
Oh, lots of biases. And actually, because we will later talk about that, bias is not, even if you start your anti-bias journey and you start to get more conscious about it, even then you will still have lots of unconscious bias. What do I have? Well, actually all sorts of bias. One thing that I find myself again and again thinking is, like, sometimes in Germany when you're at a train station, there's someone is saying via the speaker system, you know, just watch out, there's people around who are picking pockets. Yeah. And you know what I realize every time is, who am I looking at?
Oh, yeah.
I'm looking at certain people who could be pickpockets in my worldview, and other people, you know, don't seem to be, or I don't think that's this about them. So this is like, you know, one thing I find myself thinking again and again. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
One more question related to the intentions.
Mm-hmm.
So if I have a student who's, for example, conscious about being racist, isn't that something different than just maybe not knowing that your language is insulting to another person because you heard it somewhere and you just use it unreflected? And so it's this question of knowing about insults, not maybe something that is still important in the way that you deal with it?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think so. If the intention, I think intention matters, not that intention doesn't matter. Impact matters more. But of course, if someone is accidentally racist or ableist or sexist, you can have a conversation about that. Like, why did you say that? Did you understand it's not okay? Did you understand that it's hurtful? If it's intentional, of course, you're going to have a different conversation. Yeah, how would you go about that if it's intentional?
Yeah, I would say, of course, it's, you know, we talked about unconscious bias being conscious, and how, you know, this is the goal, to get conscious about your biases. So, of course, it's always better when people know they have a bias there. But I think it really depends on what happens after that. I mean, if it enables you, you're being conscious of your biases, to apologize very quickly, you know, because it will happen, it will continue to happen, to use racist language, ableist language, you know, to use fatphobic ideas, whatever, you know, we will not, or no one is able to totally stop that. That's why it's a lifelong journey. But yeah, if you are able to excuse very fast, or to see what you have done, and so the other person even doesn't have to say anything, I mean, that's great. If you use it as you're being conscious as an excuse, like, oh, I know I'm doing it, so it's not bad. And of course, you know, this would have a very negative effect. Mm-hmm. And sometimes this actually happens in certain circles, mm-hmm. that people think, oh, you know, they are being so reflective, they are so conscious of their biases, and then they think it excludes them, or it makes it okay to say certain things, but of course it's not the case.
Why is it important for teachers to learn about mm-hmm. their own unconscious biases mm-hmm. and to make them conscious?
Of course, it's important for everyone, but it's especially important for teachers, because biases influence how you perceive people, how you perceive their actions. And for example, it impacts whom do you perceive as capable? Whom do you think will be capable to learn these things or these things, and who might be incapable? This has something to do with bias, because it's of these stories we tell ourselves about people. So if you are not conscious of your biases, they will impact your work, of course. They always impact your work. And it might happen that you build barriers for students or their family, and might not even recognize that you're doing it, because your bias is not conscious. So actually, if your bias stays unconscious, or the biases you have stay unconscious, you might not be able to do a good job as a teacher. And yeah, it just really prevents you from detecting or analyzing barriers and being able to remove them. One important thing, and I already said it, like, it's a lifelong journey, but it's really important that in the perspective of the anti-bias approach or anti-bias education, the goal is not to be totally bias-free, but the goal is to be bias-conscious, actually. And yeah, we are going to talk about it later, like the microwave perspective, that this is not something you learn in 2 days of training or 1 week of training. This is like a lifelong process. It takes really time to unlearn or to become conscious of your biases. And so yeah, and the goal is not to be bias-free. And actually, the German version of the anti-bias approach, anti-bias education, is actually called Vorurteilsbewusste Bildung und Erziehung. And the Vorurteilsbewusst, for those not speaking German, is actually the bias conscious. So it's a translation for it.
What are the understanding, knowledge and skills needed for teachers to realize anti-bias education in their everyday work?
We think they need certain knowledge, certain skills, and for being more inclusive, for realizing anti-bias education. And we think often these are different things that people imagine it to be, because sometimes teachers imagine they now have to know about every disability that exists. They have to know about, they have to know like 15 languages, because 15 languages are spoken in their classroom, and they have to know about every culture that exists. And of course, you know, often, or this is not necessary, but the kind of knowledge and skills we mean are differently. We think, but not only just we, but in anti-bias education, it's thought that teachers need to know about, they need to know about their society, what differences exist in their societies, and how does it impact people's lives and people's perception of the world, because we are not all perceiving the world in the same way, because it depends so much on how we are positioned socially or just in our society. So teachers need to know about differences and how they play out. They need to know about who is affected by barriers and what these barriers might cause, and also who has privilege and what can be effects of these privileges, because they need to know that because of privilege it might be hard to really perceive some barriers that are actually really easily to perceive for people who are affected by these barriers. So they need to know why it might be hard to analyze some barriers for their students and families. Teachers also need to know about discrimination and how it works, what forms it can take, so they can actually detect discrimination when it happens in a school, and it does happen in a school. So yeah, we think there's like a whole bunch of knowledge they need to have, so to be able to make their classroom more inclusive and to realize anti-bias education.
What do future teachers need to understand about discrimination, or how discrimination works?
Yes, we've already said that they need the knowledge about what discrimination can actually be, how it can look like, to be able to detect it and to stop it in their classroom and in their school. And one problem when we talk about discrimination in our societies, and this is not just for one society but for several societies, is we have a very narrow picture of what discrimination can be actually. We have often the idea that there's a certain form of discrimination we imagine. It's a situation, it's an interaction, and it's between a person who is biased, who actually has bad intentions, and who is, for example, racist towards another person, and might even become violent, like physically violent. This is what we imagine, and of course this can be discrimination, this can happen, but so many forms of discrimination look totally different. There are forms of discrimination in interactions which are much more subtle and are really, really hard to perceive when you're not affected by it. One form of these more subtle discriminations is, for example, microaggressions. We talked about it in the group. There's a video, and we will also put it in the chapter. There's a video which uses a metaphor for microaggressions, that it's like a mosquito bite. And some people get bitten like once a year, once a month, and it doesn't really harm them so much. But some people get bitten every day, several times, and it all really sums up, and it's really harmful in the end, and it just really hurts them because it's so much. And you can think about microaggressions in this way, as like small situations that seem harmless to some people, but are really, really negatively affecting the lives of other people. And we talked about the example in our group, the question, the famous question, where are you from? And often the follow-up question, but where are you really from, or where are your parents from? This is like a very, this is a form of microaggression that happens to people who are not perceived to be from the country they live in, be it because they have like dark hair, maybe dark skin, but also like maybe they have a name that seems not to be German or Dutch or Swedish or whatever. And this question might seem very, very harmless to people who are not affected by racism, but for people who get asked this question again and again, it's something that sends them the message, okay, actually you don't look like you're from here, and I don't think you're from here, that's why I'm asking you, and maybe even asking you, but where are you really from? And it sends the message in the end that you don't really belong here. And it's really easy if you get asked this so many times to feel excluded at some point. And so it really does damage even these small forms of discrimination. And yeah, so there's a lot of discrimination that happens in interactions in more visible forms, but also more like subtle forms. And then it's also important to know that there are forms of discrimination that are actually not happening in interactions, but are part of institutions. So they are like discrimination that's systemic or institutional, and discrimination can be woven into processes, how things get decided, how things are done, for example, in classrooms and in schools. And it's really, really hard to detect these kind of discriminations, and so you really have to know what it can be like or what can it look like. One last thing about discrimination is to be conscious or to know that it's not intentions that decide, and actually in everyday school life it often happens that you can have teachers have the best of intentions and still discriminate against students or their families. So your intentions do not decide whether it's discrimination or not, and it could actually happen when you think you're doing something really good or you're saying something really good. So this is also important to, when something happens and someone tells you, when you're in interaction and someone tells you, oh, you know, I feel discriminated against, or this feels like discrimination, then not to think, oh, but you know, my intention was good, so it cannot be discrimination, but to see, okay, what effect does it have on the other person? Maybe something happened that I didn't even perceive of, or this person, you know, has been asked this question like 500 times before, and that's why it like, you know, might hurt or they might feel excluded. So really to be in dialogue, and to, if someone tells you, then to apologize and to ask them maybe to explain if you don't understand, but not be, not discuss your intentions, because it doesn't really matter what the intention of the speaker is.
I just wondered, is there a form of asking the question, like, where did you grow up, that is more appropriate and less excluding? Because it's often used as small talk and to connect to people.
For me, it depends on it depends on context. For example, some people ask me, "Where are you from?" And then, of course, I say the Netherlands, and then the follow-up question is, "Where are you really from?" And they don't even know my name. So why do you want to know where I'm from before you even got to know me a little bit? I have friends that I found out are from Ethiopia or from other countries, because you naturally get there. You will get there. Where did you grow up? Those are getting to know each other questions. But oftentimes it's like the first thing, and that feels like, I want to see if you belong here or not. So for me, that's the difference. Yeah,
I would totally agree. Like, because it's not about never asking this question again, because this is something sometimes what people understand, but it's not what it's about. Of course, you know, people should be interested in each other, but really just to think about when am I asking these questions, and who am I asking this question? Maybe even if you know, oh, this might be someone who's asked this question a lot, maybe just wait like a little bit longer than you would have waited for someone else. But yeah, just be sensitive, or maybe even you can even say, I know you might, I'm really interested. You might be asked this a lot, but is it okay if I ask you? And I think the key is also, if someone says they are from, I don't know, Berlin or Amsterdam or whatever, to accept this. And not, I think the follow-up question is also very central in the feeling of like, being discriminated against. So just accept what they say.
Yeah, but also I think for me, what also makes us different is makes a difference is sometimes people ask, what is your background? Like, what's your cultural background? That's something really different for me, because it's not where are you really from, because that insinuates like you don't really belong here. But what's your background? Yeah, of course, everybody's got a background. And we're fine with a question like that. So it's really the timing and how do you formulate the question.
Yeah, and everyone has a family culture or something.
Yeah, of course.
Why is intersectionality relevant when it comes to anti-bias education?
Yeah, so intersectionality is a way of describing how multiple social identities come together. So picture it as a crossroads where, for example, well, take myself, for example, I am a Moroccan, so I'm not white, and I am disabled, and I am a woman. So all those things come together and kind of actually form a new kind of discrimination. You can also see this, you see this a lot with black women. So misogynar becomes like an own discrimination type. And it's really important to be aware of that, because a student as well can have multiple layers of discrimination that they face. So you need to be aware that there can be multiple needs. So for example, a disabled student can have access needs that you need to accommodate, but also if they are from an immigrant family and the language that from the country that you live in is not their first language, they might also need support in language learning. So there can be a need there. So it's really important to not get stuck on one identity and one social identity, but really look at the possible intersections of their identities. So.
Yeah. And may I add that, like, for example, because in Germany it's always a big discussion about immigration, and probably not just in Germany, but like, and we talk in a very simple way about it, and we don't think in an intersectional way about it. For example, we often just see, oh, someone is an immigrant or someone's family came to Germany, but we don't see, oh, you know, they may also be like affected by poverty, and often it's actually the poverty and not so much the immigration that decides, you know, if they are faced with barriers in schools. And so we just think about, we form people into groups, and then we think about these groups as if they have all like the same problems, the same barriers, and often that's just not true. So it really needs this approach, this intersectional approach.
Why an intersectional approach should be adopted in realizing anti-bias education?
So we're talking about intersectionality, and within the context of anti-bias education, we believe that an intersectional approach to anti-bias education is very crucial, because learners can experience different form of biases and discrimination based on their identities, beliefs, personal values. So marginalization can take place based on, you know, individuals' dimensions of their identities. That is why we need to understand that an intersectional approach to implementing anti-bias education is crucial. In real life, we have sexism, racism, and disability intersect. And that is why, for example, the experiences of a girl student of an immigrant background, you know, being bullied and marginalized will, you know, cut across many dimensions, you know, being a girl, being of a migrant background, and possibly of a culturally diverse background. So understanding that there are so many layers to people's experiences of biases and discrimination, so it's important to have an intersectional approach to anti-bias education, and that is why we are, you know, taking that into consideration in this chapter.
What could a deficit approach to anti-bias education look like, and why and how can it be avoided?
So a deficit approach to anti-bias education could be a situation when teachers or educators view the introduction of anti-bias education as a result of students, you know, from marginalized backgrounds or culturally diverse backgrounds performed poorly in their studies or academically as a result of their socio-cultural backgrounds. So we believe that an anti-bias education should be seen as part of the learning experiences of all students, particularly in a diverse context. And like we've been made to understand, diversity ranges from gender, identity, ethnic backgrounds, personal beliefs and values. So a deficit approach is to not see, a deficit approach is to see antibiotics education as a response to a problem. However, we argue that an antibiotics education should be a school-wide commitment because it adds richness to the experiences of students in their learning journey.
What is microwave antibiotics education and how can this be avoided?
So we are introducing the concept of microwave antibiotics education, building on the concept of microwave equity that was coined by a US-based educator, Cornelius Minor, and he explained microwave equity as the process of trying to achieve equity within a short period of time. So he argues that the goals of equity cannot be achieved overnight. And when we know, the use of a microwave, we know we prepare meals that are not very rich. Using microwave is not an healthy way of eating by just having microwave food. So, building on that, it's also important to know that a commitment to equity in education should be a lifelong investment and commitment, should not be seen as a checklist, but an ongoing process. And so building on that concept, we also feel that antibiotics education should be a lifelong commitment, should be seen as an ongoing process. It also speaks to understanding the difference between equity and equality in education. This is very crucial for educators. Like in my own personal research, my own doctoral research with teachers and student teachers, it's very difficult for them sometimes to understand the importance of the difference between equity and equality in education. Equity is based on needs, responding to the needs of a particular learning need of a student in order to give the student the same level of opportunity as others. While equality in education is treating all the students as the same, is based on fairness. However, we know that, as we've talked about earlier, about intersectionality in antibiotics education, there are different socio-cultural backgrounds and experiences of students that makes learning difficult for them. So we believe that a commitment to antibiotics education, a lifelong commitment to antibiotics education will make us avoid the microwave approach.
What is the link between antibiotics education and an inclusive learning environment?
Well, I think, so we think the goal of an inclusive learning is to ensure that all students have access to equitable and quality education. So we believe that having an antibiotics education adds to the richness to students' learning, add richness to student learning, making students develop critical thinking skills. So it's all about being inclusive, ensuring that all students are empowered, to be able to confront, bias, discrimination, and be active social citizens. And antibiotics education adds to inclusive education by recognizing the vital role of identity, diversity, activism, and issues of equity and social justice.
How can teachers incorporate antibiotics content into the curriculum and teaching materials?
So one of the ways that teachers can incorporate antibiotics education into curriculum would be to engage in culturally responsive pedagogies. Culturally responsive pedagogies is defined as a pedagogical approach where teachers incorporate or use the cultural experiences of their students in teaching and learning to ensure that all students have an equitable and quality access to education. So engaging in culturally responsive pedagogy, inclusive of students' socio-cultural backgrounds. We know students or learners come into the classroom with diverse experiences. So teachers being able to acknowledge, value, and include these diverse experiences into teaching and learning is one way of incorporating anti-bias education into curriculum and teaching and learning approaches. Another way would be to being open to learning from students. It's also important for teachers to understand that within the classroom, they are not the only source of knowledge. So being particularly, this is important for culturally diverse backgrounds where students are coming from a diverse backgrounds that might be very different or far from the experience, the cultural experience of the teachers. So teachers, understanding that they can incorporate, to a greater extent the student voice by learning from them, and then it becomes easier to incorporate, include anti-bias education in teaching and learning.
How can teachers raise critical awareness among students?
There are several ways that we believe that teachers can raise critical awareness. That would be to engage in critical pedagogy. Critical pedagogy also relates to culturally responsive pedagogies too. So critical pedagogy allows teachers encouraging students to engage in deep learning, and this can be done through self-reflection. Self-reflection, sort of develops into an awareness of personal bias, values, discrimination, and to be able to also sort of confront, discrimination within the larger society. So making students being able to think critically, to self-reflect, are the ways that we think that teachers can help in developing the critical thinking of students.
How can teachers develop a sense of fairness and justice among students?
Teachers developing a sense of fairness and justice among students, well, I think it's important to acknowledge that that will be quite very difficult to do, but it is possible, and it begins with the teacher. Teachers being inclusive, being aware of their own cultural biases or worldview. Like in my work as a teacher educator, organizing culturally responsive pedagogies with teachers. Before introducing the pedagogical approaches and how to implement, I ask the student teachers to reflect on what they think what is culture to them and how they define their culture to people from other backgrounds. Making them to be aware of the complexities that come with culture. So being inclusive, being aware as a teacher, can help in guiding the students, to be fair and to be aware of biases within and outside of the classrooms.
How can teachers respond or react to issues of bias and discrimination? So
it's very similar to the question of developing fairness among students. So again, teachers being aware of their own bias, it starts with the teachers, and this can help teachers to serve as role models to students, encouraging deep thinking, critical thinking, self-reflection among students. And teachers can also engage in restorative justice approach, which is acknowledging and taking responsibility for mistakes, both the past mistakes and the present. So these are some of the ways that teachers can engage to develop this sort of attributes even in their students.
Okay. How can teachers build relationships and partnerships with parents for anti-bias education and engage parents in the education of their children, particularly those from minority ethnic backgrounds?
Yes, so we think that it is important for teachers to maximize the knowledge of parents when it comes to their students, parents of their students. We believe that no one knows the children more than the parents. So teachers can actually take advantage of this knowledge base. There are theories that that, they have explained this sort of knowledge as fonts of knowledge, where, teachers can use can learn from the experiences of the, cultural, social-cultural, activities of the students, and at home, outside of the classroom, and can bring this into the classroom and incorporate it into teaching and learning. And we believe that one of the ways this can be done is to better engagement and involvement with parents, understanding that they can learn about their students from their parents. And in building this relationship, particularly for parents of migrant backgrounds or minority ethnic groups, because research also shows that, parents of migrants or minority ethnic backgrounds don't get involved, and because of so many things that we may not have time to unpack in this chapter. So it is important for teachers to be proactive, understanding the benefits of engaging parents, because better engagement of parents actually, from research, leads to better behavior from students and, possibly, better learning outcomes. So make the first move. Teachers can make the first move. For parents that are not very confident or aware of how the education system is being run, teachers making the first move in terms of initiating contacts, having personal invites, phone calls, instead of writing letters. For instance, if migrant parents don't understand the language, don't have a good understanding proficiency in the language of the host country, which is the language of instruction in school. So teachers writing letters to parents to such parents might not yield the expected results. So personal phone calls should be encouraged. Personal invitation should be encouraged. And I know it's quite very difficult understanding that teachers are quite very busy and expected to do a lot of things. But ultimately, the goal, I believe, for every educator and teacher is to see that all the students in their classroom, have access to that equal opportunity of learning in terms of equitable and quality education.